The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Where faith comes to life.
Well, hello and welcome along to the programme. I'm Justin Brierley, and today on The Profile, I'm really pleased to be joined by theologian Robert Beckford. He's most recently presented a TV programme on the battle for Christianity on BBC, but he's well known in his own right as a theologian and author, particularly working in the area of black theology and culture and Christianity. So it's a real treat to have Robert join me for The Profile this afternoon. Don't forget you can find more interviews with Christians in all walks of life, especially theology. We often do theologians of one kind or another. If you want to find out more, go to premierchristianity.com/free sample to get yourself a free sample copy of the magazine. Robert, welcome along to the programme today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
It's great to have you. Robert, we like to start at the beginning on The Profile. You grew up, I understand, in Northampton, which kind of makes a connection between us, because I'm also from that part of the world. Do you want to tell us about life growing up and your influences?
Yeah, that's right. I was born in Northampton and lived for the first 8 years of my life down the road in Wellingborough. There was a sizable African-Caribbean community, a lot of the Jamaican diaspora, who ended up in Northampton because of the old shoe industry. It's still going a little bit, the old cobbler industry. So my father's brother made the journey in the 1950s and then invited lots of his family members to come over. My father was one of them, and my mother came not with my father because they got married in Britain, but she came via a similar kind of connection. Life there was blissful because it was a small town, small market town. It was in the 1970s that I was growing up there, and at those days, I feel quite old saying that now, there were fewer cars on the road, which meant you could play football all day and all night without worry of cars coming down the road. Also, I remember being 6 years old and walking about a mile every day to school, and I don't think that would happen today, that you'd let a 6-year-old cross two main roads and walk a mile to school. Also, luckily, at the end of my road, there was a large park and field, so we used to spend a lot of time when we weren't in church or at home, just playing games in the field. So it was really quite idyllic the first 8 years. Then it all went wrong. We moved to Coventry, the big city, the big smoke. My father thought that the future was in the car industry. Little did he know that by 1973 there'd be an economic downturn and the car industry would collapse and would enter a post-industrial phase in Britain. But he thought that Coventry and the cities were the place to go. So we actually moved to Coventry when I was 8 or 9, and life was very different. I became streetwise and very urban, I would say, in contrast to being a country boy from Northampton in my early years.
Was there a sort of black church community that you were part of both in your time in Northampton and in Coventry?
Yes, there was. My mother pioneered 2 churches during her lifetime. The first one was in Wellingborough. We were originally part of what was known as the Pilgrim Holiness Church movement, which was a charismatic African-Caribbean church tradition, which eventually joined up with the Wesleyan Methodists and became the Wesleyan Church. But my mother helped to establish the church in Wellingborough and Northampton, and then she did the same thing when we moved to Coventry. So my mother was a real church planter, very dynamic, very articulate, and very committed woman of God who basically steered us all towards church and things of church for the first 18 or 19 years that we were at home.
Sounds like she was a pretty influential character in your own Christian journey then.
Oh, completely. But my mother and father complemented each other because my mother was a person of faith. My dad was slightly more political. He was a trade unionist. And although he went to church in his later years, there was always a tension in my household between the things of faith and the things of politics. So I ended up merging the two eventually by becoming a political theologian. So I like to think that my dad gave me a sense of the way in which you go about changing the world practically, and my mother provided me with the kind of inspirational tools that you need to ensure that you are motivated and connected and have the right kind of spirituality to make those changes possible and long-lasting.
How important was it, would you say, for your parents and you and the community who gathered to sort of have that identity, that shared identity that would have come out of that church community?
Oh, it was vitally important because churches and migrant churches, immigrant churches, are not just places of worship, they're also community centres. And this was true back in the 1970s. It's true also today. If you go to a country and you're looking to find your people, you go to a religious institution, you get fed spiritually, but you also make contact with other people who can help you find shelter or work. And that's what we grew up with, the church as a real institution. It provided help and support for Caribbean immigrants who were struggling to work out their place and space within post-war Britain. So the church was fundamental to our existence. I often think that not enough is made of the way in which the church helped knit together black communities from the Caribbean in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s. There's lots of research material in terms of books, but I don't think visual media or print media has really done justice to how much work was done to empower and resource people who found themselves as travellers in a strange land.
I mean, people do sometimes today bemoan the fact that, in a sense, churches can often be split down lines of colour. And I think was it Martin Luther King who said of America that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America and so on. I mean, but then at the same time, what I'm hearing from you is having that shared identity, that cultural aspect to the church community for an immigrant population was in its own way quite helpful. Is that fair?
Yeah, completely. I think completely. I think there is a place for churches that cater to a particular ethnic group. But what we know from our sociological friends and our friends who teach cultural studies is that identities change.
Yeah.
People change.
Yeah.
So the African Caribbean community 40 years ago is very different to the community today. It's much more diverse, much more hybrid in terms of its identity, and much more English, to be quite honest. So the key issue for all churches is how to ensure that their worshiping spaces are inclusive. And that's the challenge, because church often means tradition, and tradition means fixity and fixing things and not changing them, when it should actually mean the opposite. It should be about freedom and fluidity and a space where all people can find refuge. Now, in order to do that, you've got to have a cultural centre that is, for want of a better word, cosmopolitan, one that can absorb and engage with diverse cultures, diverse histories. And I would say that there are very few people who are skilled at doing that kind of cultural work in church. Often it's a case of either or. And I think that's the way we've ended up in Britain. There are very few places where you get that kind of inclusivity at every level, not just in the congregation, but also in leadership. That's the holy grail, to a degree, of church life, having inclusion from the top to the bottom. Yeah.
And do you think we are starting to see more integrated churches in that sense? I know that the black church, just as much as, to use the phrase, a white church, has an issue with second and third generation young people who maybe are struggling to see what the relevance is anymore of church to their life.
Oh, completely. The statistics that we worked with a few years ago that came out of a BBC poll demonstrated that the number of African Caribbean people or people of African Caribbean heritage going to church had shrunk from something like 80% 20 years ago to now down below 40, well, in the 40s. It was quite different in the West African church community, where roughly about 80% of the people had some connection with a church community. So, yeah, I think there is a issue, if not a crisis, for all churches in terms of engaging with the next generation and making faith relevant and finding ways in which you can do church that appeal to people. I think what may be different in terms of the African Caribbean community is that some research has demonstrated that men in particular are more likely to find Islam as a more receptive and empowering faith than Christianity. So that's an interesting dynamic that the church has to engage with. But there is a struggle across Britain. There is a battle, to quote the phrase of the programme, to make Christianity relevant and dynamic. But it can be done. And I think the point that you've raised about culture is vital. If cultures have changed and are much more inclusive, Saturday night when people go raving, it's quite inclusive, quite dynamic. What we have to do is switch Saturday and Sunday and make Sunday night inclusivity take the place of the divisions that we face on Sunday. And you can only do that by creating a culture like street culture, like dance culture, that's quite dynamic and inclusive, and that speaks to a multiplicity of people.
We'll come back to talking about the battle for Christianity, but I just wanted to kind of take us a bit further in your own story. I understand it was an RE teacher who really ignited your love of theology. Do you want to tell us about that?
That's right. I went to an inner city comprehensive school. It wasn't as bad as that sounds because it was a former girls' grammar school, which meant that most of the teachers were schooled in the old grammar school way, so they made sure that discipline was very important, homework was important, and also having high expectations of children from all ethnicities was also very important. There just seemed to be more opportunity then than I feel often I hear other children, including my own children, talk about. But so there's a sense that you could achieve anything. There was a British equivalent of the American dream, I think, in the 1980s, 70s, 80s. Partly because you didn't have to pay for your degree course, so you could dream a bit more of life without debt. But I had a fantastic RE teacher, Mrs. Jewell, and another one called Mrs. Delgado. And what they did was make religion a current affairs issue. So we didn't study it in isolation. We didn't look at Judaism and say, isn't that an interesting religious system? We looked at Judaism in relation to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We didn't just look at moral issues like drug taking or substance abuse isolated from the economic conditions that caused young people to get involved in the drugs trade. So there was this brilliant ability that they had to connect faith, religion, with popular culture, with social justice, which meant that religion wasn't just a private affair or something that you studied outside of the historical and social world. It was the opposite. It was something that was fundamental to interpreting the way in which the world worked. And that really appealed to me as a 13, 14-year-old. So I made sure that I took a O-level and an A-level RE just because of the passion that I had from home in terms of taking faith seriously, but then also meeting these really creative, really dynamic teachers who made me aware of the fact that faith was social, political, cultural, and that you had to make all of those connections to do theology in a meaningful way.
You obviously had this unique combination of your mum and dad, kind of, which propelled you in the direction of finding this interest in the political side of theology. What was, though, generally, were you encouraged by the church community, or is there any kind of, a wariness of academic theology within the black church community?
Oh, yeah, I think it's a really good question. I would say I was quite fortunate because I was able to avoid two powerful forces within the church that depoliticize people. The first one was just not seeing book learning as being fundamental to ministry. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just that within Pentecostal church traditions, the call to preach and teach comes from God. And some people go to Bible college, some people will have an apprenticeship. But generally, there isn't a strong tradition of using the Western way of knowing about God in order to know God. So people will know God through reading the Bible, prayer, personal devotion, communal worship, rather than feeling that they need to go and read Church Dogmatics by Karl Barth. They just don't see those two as being fundamental to ministering to people.
Yeah.
I was lucky to have RE teachers who said, no, you need to do that kind of work. But also, growing up in the 1970s, particularly late 1970s, there was incredible political strife out on the streets in all urban centres. Economic decline, Margaret Thatcher, pop culture, the music, the politics was all quite fractious. And as a consequence, you had to be not spiritually blind, you had to be dead physically not to be engaged with what was happening on your doorstep. So I grew up with friends who were part of political groups, musical groups, cultural groups, which were engaged in social and political activity. And that drew me, again, drew me out of the church context and made me realise that I needed to engage with these particular issues. And people of my age group, from my background, will know about the rise of Rastafari and the impact that had on African Caribbean communities in terms of providing an alternative spirituality for many young black people, particularly young black men. So I realised that I had to find a way of making my faith relevant to the social and political world, cultural movements like Rastafari, and not dismiss them, but find ways in which I could incorporate them into my own spirituality and my own practice. And that was important, finding a point of correlation and connection rather than simply seeing it as a case of either or.
I mean, one of your best-known books, or the one that at least introduced me to your work, was Jesus' Dread, and that does feature a Rastafarian-looking Jesus on the cover. But the book is fundamentally about the black church community and ethnic minority communities needing to kind of appropriate theology for themselves in ways that aren't simply sort of shaped by a kind of Western white kind of theology. So what I mean, what some people might say, well, theology is theology. Surely, why do we need these kind of cultural forms of theology? What's your response?
I would say that's a really ignorant position to begin with, because we know that the biblical text itself is quite diverse and has competing groups writing about history and writing about God. We have four gospels with different perspectives on Jesus. And then we have a proliferation of church traditions in terms of how people read the Bible and express their faith in light of that. So one of the strengths of Christianity is its diversity, and also it's, on one level, the fact that people don't disagree is a good thing, because it provides an opportunity for what is central to Christianity, which is reconciliation. So for me, I've always thought it important to work with the African Caribbean Christian tradition, and more broadly the African diaspora tradition, which incorporates Christianity in North America and the African continent, in order to understand that tradition, but also place it in dialogue with, and at times a critique of, other theological traditions. So to put that simply, what I try and do is look at how Caribbean people in Britain, in North America, have understood Christianity, and how is that similar to, but also dissimilar to, what's happened in Christian traditions in Britain and also in North America, and then how do we reconcile the two? And it's fundamentally important, because the big issue that we haven't resolved in Christian theology in North America and in Britain is slavery, and the way in which Christianity was, on the one hand, complicit with slavery, but also, on the other hand, part of the traditions that attempted to eradicate slavery and racialized oppression. I always often joke with my students, when you're teaching, you've always got to have a trick up your sleeve if you need a bit of a rest. So I often say to students in one course, go to the library and find out how many books you can discover written by English theologians on animals, on animal theology, a thriving discipline. They come back 20 minutes later and say, we found 40 or 50 books by these various authors. Then I say, go and see how many books you can find by English Christian theologians on race, on dealing with Christianity's 500-year sojourn with racialized oppression. And they come back 20 minutes later and say, we found 2.
Yeah.
So I then say to them, well, I'd like to think that my pet degus and fish make it to heaven, and that animals do have souls. That's important, because it's all part of realizing that we're all connected to the divine, and maybe we are abusing animals. But I'm sure that God's going to have something to say to a guild that write more about animals than dealing with human affairs, and particularly, Holocaust issues within the Caribbean that concern Christianity. So I think we haven't worked it out at the level of theology, and as a consequence of that, it has impacts on our inability to find ways of reconciling in a meaningful way ethnic divisions and tensions in the social world from the base of the church.
Let's talk about the recent TV program that you presented, The Battle for Christianity. So what kind of a battle is going on, and who's winning it, Robert?
Well, the battle is for the soul of the nation. It is how Christianity can be relevant to a post-Christian demographic who are not interested in church, who are interested in personal forms of spirituality, no spirituality at all. And how do they do that from a context where, in many churches, it's an aging population that have to do the outreach work? That's one battle. The other battle is amongst the churches that are doing incredibly well. There are churches that have bucked the trend. There were Anglican churches, Holy Trinity Brompton, evangelical Pentecostal churches like Hillsong, specifically ethnic churches like the Redeemed Church of God, who are doing incredibly well and have bucked the trend. But what we're intrigued with those churches is how they then engage with a rising liberalism in terms of morality amongst young people and the British population as a whole. So whereas 30 years ago we know that most people in Britain were against homosexual marriage, now the statistics show that the vast majority of people are quite happy for homosexual marriage to take place. Well, so we look at the battle then amongst these churches to engage with an audience a populace who have a very different morality. And what we find is quite intriguing. It's quite contradictory in that despite the churches that are doing well have a conservative or biblical-based morality, they're doing incredibly well despite the changes out there, which suggests that they are winning. They are winning people who want a particular framework to live their lives by, a particular set of values that they want to follow, and a distinctive community that they want to be a part of. So it's the mega churches, the evangelical churches, the Pentecostal charismatic churches, which are heavy on dynamic worship and very focused on their morality, which seem to have the winning combination for bucking the trend.
It is a very interesting thing, because very often what we're told by people, both within and outside the church, is it's only when the church kind of catches up with modern society and its values around sexuality, abortion and all of that, that the church will be deemed relevant and people want to go back. But you're kind of seeing the opposite. It's the churches which are actually kind of holding to a more traditional kind of Christian ethic on those issues that seem to be actually growing numerically. So it is an odd thing. Yeah, it is an odd thing, but it's really quite complex because although they're called conservative or traditional, they're really not. I think a better description is that they're biblical, because while they might be conservative on family morality, they're quite radical when it comes to issues of social justice. And this is why the church often gets in trouble when it engages in politics, because they're seen as either being hyper-conservative or being, leftist and crazy. Yeah.
But instead, what they're actually doing is standing upon biblical principles in terms of how they see it. They believe in a God who promotes a particular sense of community and family, but also a God who's just. So they're going to speak out against injustice.
The church that does maybe have a more conservative, let's say, theology on gay marriage, for instance, is quite likely also to be running a food bank and doing the job centre and whatever on its premises.
That's it. And I think that's what makes these churches more biblically based than just being conservative with a small c. Although I'm quite critical in that documentary about the kind of social justice work that they're doing, because often it's better understood as social welfare, meeting needs of local communities, whereas social justice implies structural critique and structural engagement. So on the food bank issue, churches that are involved in welfare feed the people. People involved in social justice are doing advocacy work and saying to the government, why are you cutting these benefits, or why aren't you ensuring that these provisions are being met, and we need to work out ways in which we ensure that you do your job as a government. So it's a slightly different dynamic at work that distinguishes social justice from social welfare. So in the film, I kind of have a admiration for the welfare work, but also steer the audience in the direction of social justice, which is a more sustained structural critique of systems and government.
How would you say your kind of view on Christianity, your approach to faith has changed since you probably first made a commitment as a young man, as a child even, in your mother's church?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. I would say I can answer it quite simply.
Go on.
I was brought up to see God and faith as something to be afraid of.
Really?
So you became a Christian because you feared hell.
Okay.
And that was part of the Pentecostal fire and brimstone preaching tradition. People who from Jamaica or the Caribbean and around about my age group in their 40s or 50s will understand that tradition where we heard fire and brimstone preaching and thought, my goodness, God could strike us down at any moment, and that's it.
Yeah.
Won't even get to see Coventry win the FA Cup, so I better get on the right side of the track. So I think there was a lot of fear, to be quite honest, and fear of death, fear of hell, fear of God. Obviously, having grown up in the church, having travelled, having studied Christian theology and teaching it, I would say I'm juxtaposed to that now, where I see God much more as a God of love and justice, and those two sides of God's being fundamental to my own worship experience, my own devotional experience, and also I would say seeing God as being much more inclusive. The faith that I had of the early days was very exclusive. You had to be saved, sanctified to make sure you were going to heaven, and you had to belong to our church. You didn't belong to our denomination, you weren't going to get there. All these other Christians, we didn't know what they were doing because they didn't worship in the same place that we did. So it's very narrow.
Sure.
I think I'm much more inclusive now, not just in terms of various denominations, but, and this may upset a few people, but even in terms of religious traditions. I'm an inclusivist in the sense that I believe that there are many pathways to God. I just can't believe that an all-powerful, loving God would be crazy enough to say there's only one narrow tradition over a particular period of human history by which people can know God. And I think that broadness is affirmed within the biblical traditions of Melchizedek in the Old Testament, where we have people who know about God who we don't necessarily know aren't part of the story. And similarly, there are teachings in the New Testament which suggest that the church and faith is much broader than we think. So I'm much more inclusive in that sense, but I'm also much more committed to justice. I think that justice is at the heart of God, and to be committed to God is to struggle for justice in this world. I think that is the signature for me of being Christian.
Do you find, having gone on that journey, you're both obviously still very much your roots and your identity is in the black church community that you grew up in and you continue to write about and do theology alongside. But at the same time, I can imagine some in that church kind of wonder, hey, where's Robert gone? He's taken on all these new ideas and gone in different directions. So how do you kind of work out that balance of where you've come from and where you are now?
I hope so. I hope they've thought that, because if not, I wouldn't have gone. I think that life and faith is about growth, change, and challenge. And I think that if you're in the same place for 30 years, it's problematic in terms of your thinking and your growth, because the world is changing around you. Ultimately, you have to be true to what yourself and what you believe and what you believe you are being called to do, and you run with that, because God can only call you, can't call your impersonation of somebody else. So I've always tried to stay true to what I believe and what I feel is central to my understanding of faith. That doesn't mean that you act in isolation or are not connected to other people and don't take on board what other members of your church say or family members say. I do. That's part of that's a really important part of being in community, is listening and hearing other people. But I'm not too fussed about what people think or say. I'm more concerned about if I can get it right in terms of what I'm being called to do. That's more important to me. And ultimately, the fruit is what you measure people by. And I'd like to think that the projects I've been involved with in prisons, working with young people at risk, working with students, hard to reach students from BME communities, being involved in political campaigns around world poverty, around reparations for slavery, and seeing those projects thrive and bear fruit would be evidence that it's not all too bad, and that there is divine presence and blessing in this work.
Just quickly as we conclude, if somebody's inspired, maybe a young person, to go on the journey you've been on, it's not too late for them to be taught by Robert Beckford. You actually you've got some courses coming up, I believe, at Canterbury Christ Church University. That's right.
Although my main base is at Canterbury, I also teach in London. So for people who are interested in studying theology over 2 days a week for a full degree in theology over 3 years, they can join us at Christ College in Woolwich. We're actually running taster events on the 7th and 14th of May for anybody who's interested in studying Christian theology. You don't need to have A-levels. We are willing to look at students who have lots of life experience, mature students, as well as young people who have a lot of energy and commitment to learning. And we've structured a course that it makes it starting point for people who don't have traditional academic skills, and we bring them up to standard, and over 3 years take them towards a BA in theology. So that's a satellite project sponsored by Canterbury Christ Church University for people who are interested in studying theology. But basically what we realised was that there's a lot of people who want to study, but they've got jobs, they've got ministries, and to fit it all in. So we teach all of our courses all day Friday, all day Saturday, and most of our materials, like most universities, are online, so people can go online and catch up on reading that way. So do try and join us 10 till 12 o'clock on the 7th and 14th at Christ College in Woolwich. You can find it on the internet. If you just look at Christ College Woolwich, or if you Google me, Robert Beckford, you'll see details that eventually come up off those taster courses as well.
Fantastic. Well, all the very best for that, and all the very best as you continue your journey, Robert. It's been really great having you with me on The Profile today.
The pleasure has been mine. Thank you.
Well, you can find this interview with Robert Beckford in the latest edition of Premier Christianity magazine, the May 2017 edition, or go to our website and ask for a free sample copy of the mag, premierchristianity.com/free. free sample. I've been Justin Brierley, the senior editor of the magazine. On the profile in the first half of today's programme with Robert Beckford. But coming up next, we're going to be hearing a conversation between the deputy editor, Sam Hales, and Nick Spencer, author of a new book on Christianity and politics, very relevant to the upcoming general election. That's coming up next here on The Profile.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Where faith comes to life.
Well, hello and welcome to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio with me, Sam Hales. This programme is brought to you in association with the magazine that I write for and help edit. It's Premier Christianity, and if you'd like a free sample copy of the latest issue, you can head to our website, which is premierchristianity.com. You'll find loads of blogs and articles about all sorts of stuff that's going on in the news from a Christian perspective. And if you add a /free sample to that web link, so that's premierchristianity.com /free sample, you can get a free copy of the print issue. But today, here on The Profile, I'm speaking to Nick Spencer. He is the research director at Theos, which is a Christian think tank. Nick, welcome to the programme.
Hello there.
Great to have you in the studio with us today. You work for Theos, which is a Christian think tank which believes you can't understand the modern world without understanding religion. And linked to that, you've just brought out this new book. It's called The Mighty and the Almighty, How Political Leaders Do God, which is this really interesting look at how different political leaders, what they think about faith and religion. So where did that idea for this book come from?
It started a few years ago, actually, with a conversation we were having with some academics at Lancaster University and an exploration of whether there had been anything written about the Christian faith of political leaders. And it emerged that there's surprisingly little. In some countries, notably the US, of course, where faith is a very big deal, there had been some. It'd been odds and ends in the UK, but not a great deal, so we thought it would be interesting to collect and collate a series of essays. We reached 24 in the end, looking at the Christian faith of global political leaders. So this is prime ministers, presidents, chancellors over the last 40 years or so.
It's really interesting. It follows, of course, that really famous comment now of "we don't do God," which was a few years ago, which I think Alistair Campbell said about Tony Blair.
He did. I mean, it's a fascinating comment, really. He wasn't making a statement ex cathedra, as it were. It wasn't a principled statement of "we do not engage in religious speculation." He was actually closing down a particular interview. But for various reasons, partly because, in actual fact, when he was in office, Blair didn't do God, it became totemic, really, and now serves as the headline number of articles and books and so on and so forth about our attitude to religious faith in politics. I don't actually think it's accurate as it happens. It might have been right for Blair, but not really for other leaders.
But you do sometimes hear people say that, in polite conversation around the dinner table, you don't talk about religion and you don't talk about politics, and the two certainly shouldn't meet.
I know, which is why I don't talk about my work at dinner parties.
Why is that? Why is there an aversion to speaking about arguably two of the most important things in society today?
It's a very good question. I think the key word in that is important. Important means people have strongly held views, they have differing views, and I think if you wish to maintain the harmony of your Saturday night dinner party, you don't tend to invite in strongly held views that are potentially divisive about very important issues. It can be a mistake. If these things matter, you need to talk about them, but perhaps there's a time and a place.
Sure. Well, I want to drill down a bit more into your life. Here on The Profile, we always ask people about their life growing up and ask for a bit of their testimony. So do you want to tell me a bit about what early life was like for you?
Yeah, I'm an Essex boy at heart. I live in Surrey now, but my heart, I think, resides somewhere in Essex. I was brought up in a thoroughly non-Christian household. Neither mum or dad were or are believers. And I have one brother, David, and I went to school. It's a Forest school in East London, and then I went off to read history and English at university.
At what point then did you encounter Christianity?
Through poetry.
Really? How interesting.
Is the probably honest answer. Well, that's part of the answer. I read, as I said, history and English, and part of that involved reading a number of poets for whom Christianity was very seriously. It actually began before I went off to university. I had a particularly brilliant, inspirational English teacher for my last 4 years at school, and he introduced me to a number of poets whom I wouldn't have given the time of day to beforehand. And these were poets of faith, like George Herbert or John Donne, or poets of doubt, like Matthew Arnold, or Clough, or, supremely for me, T.S. Eliot. and reading them made me realise there's something serious here, something that really mattered. And so that kind of piqued my interest. At the same time, I had a very good friend who was losing his Christian faith at the time, but the very fact that his loss mattered so much to him made me realise that there was something, again, worth taking into consideration here. And then I was helped as well by the fact that as a historian, I became fascinated by the historicity of the New Testament, and it was very much more reliable than I had imagined beforehand. So it was a kind of combination of different factors that gradually, it was an Emmaus-like experience rather than anything Damascene.
It sounds like an amazing combination of sort of head and heart, in terms of the poetry being perhaps a more heart-level thing, but then, as you say, the historicity of the New Testament, that being a kind of, more academic pursuit, if you like.
I think so, yes. I mean, obviously head and heart are kind of, you can understand them in different ways. And one of the tasks of studying literature is to take a head approach to poetry. But nonetheless, I think your point stands in that you could have, for example, shown me the historical reliability of the New Testament without any of these other contextual elements in my life, and I might have raised an eyebrow. But I probably wouldn't necessarily be motivated to change a life.
Yeah, sure. So from that conversion experience, what kind of age was that?
So I was baptised when I was 20 years old, I think, 1994. So I was baptised when I was 20, that's right.
And plain sailing since then?
Is Christian life never really plain sailing, is it?
That's the correct answer, I think.
It made a huge difference, in as far as you can tell. Counterfactuals are always difficult. I don't pray anything like as much as I should, and I have kind of turbulent relationships both with Scripture and prayer, and indeed with theological reflection, which I think is as it should be. Really, I think if you're ever kind of settled in your faith, in the sense that you don't still have nagging questions or problems. Or doubts, faith and doubt being, two sides of the same coin. I suspect, your faith maybe isn't as live as it might be. So certainly not plain sailing, but life enhancing, without a doubt.
Yeah, and as I say, you're now at Theos, which is a Christian think tank. I imagine some people might think, what is a think tank, let alone a Christian one?
When we were launched back in November 2006, one extremely witty new atheist said, "Christian think tank? Surely that's a contradiction in terms," which was very funny. But we engage in the debate around the presence of religion in general, but Christianity specifically in contemporary public life, with a focus on the UK. We come from an ecumenical orthodox position, so we will draw on scripture, tradition, reason, Catholic social thoughts as well. We're not representative of any particular denomination or any particular churchmanship. We seek, through theological reflection but also empirical research, to be an intelligent, well-reasoned, hopefully even winsome Christian voice in contemporary public life.
So what does that look like for you on a sort of daily basis? What does working at Theos mean for you?
Well, I'd like to say now it's one massive long academic seminar in which we wrestle with deeply held theological views and conundrums. It isn't like that, and inevitably there's a significant element of it invariably devolves into trying to raise money. I think most jobs eventually devolve into trying to raise money. We are very generously funded by the Bible Society, covering some of our salaries, but for others and for all our research, all our public activity, all our projects and publications, we need to raise money ourselves, which means persuading potential funders that what we're doing is important. So there is a brutal element of that. But also, I suppose, the part of the job that I enjoy most as research director is partly shaping and editing and overviewing our research programme, but then also producing, writing, researching our reports, books, essays, blogs, long reads.
Yeah. And talking of books, I wanted to mention one of your previous titles, The Evolution of the West, which was published by SBCK. Very well-received book. And you argued that Christianity has shaped our values in the West. So our ethics, our sense of dignity, human rights, democracy, all of these things have Christian underpinnings. That's quite a claim, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's not a popular one. We, or at least some people at least, like to think that all the virtues we theoretically practice and the values we theoretically hold dear in the modern West came into life fully formed sometime during the Enlightenment, and we can trace our intellectual lineage back to Voltaire and Hume and Kant, but no further, because before then was just barbarity and crusades. It's nonsense. It's also equally untrue to say absolutely everything we have today we owe directly through a lineage to Christianity, and there was never any doubt about it, and so on and so forth. That's simply not true. There's a chapter in the book about democracy, and it shows that if you were to put a bet on the sentiments coming out of the lips, coming out of the mouth of an English bishop in the early 19th century, it would have been resolutely anti-democratic. So we shouldn't airbrush history here. But nonetheless, in certain absolutely key foundational aspects, such as human worth and dignity, the rule of law, the accountability and limitedness of political authority, the legitimacy of scientific research, scientific work, those kind of things are deeply rooted in a Christian worldview.
Do you think that's something that the average Christian needs to understand and take to heart? I mean, I imagine you do because you wrote a book around it, but I just wonder how that works practically for someone who perhaps, does it have implications for apologetics, for sharing our faith, that actually we should stand up for ourselves a bit more and that Christianity has contributed more to society than many may think?
I think it does. I would say that I didn't write the book for apologetic purposes. I'm delighted for it to be used for apologetic purposes. I wrote it because I like history and history is important. I think there is a link there, though. So you could say, OK, fine, that was then, but this is now. I don't think you can make that argument for two reasons. One, for the well-tried and tested Orwellian reason that he who controls the past controls the present, and he who controls the present controls the future. So if you do believe that all our modern values, or our admirable modern values, are rooted only in the 18th century, it becomes easier to write Christianity out of the future script if you've already written it out of the past script. So that's one reason why it's important and can be used apologetically. I think the second reason is that you are making a big leap of faith if you say, OK, I acknowledge that Christianity was foundational in the formation of these values, but we don't need it anymore. We're like the toddler who used a kind of a little walking frame to get them walking, and now we're able to walk, and we don't need the kind of the infrastructure, theological infrastructure to justify it, to sustain all these different values. Well, I don't think so, and I think this is where actually the Christian doctrine of sin comes in. I suspect that we are inclined to slide away from a number of these important political and public values, and that deep down, not just at a historical level, but at a philosophical level, we need a serious Christian commitment to sustain some of these values.
Are they under threat in the sense that, people might sometimes say religion is being squeezed out of public life? Is that the sort of position that you take?
It's not being formally squeezed out of public life, but there is a kind of an informal pressure against public manifestation of religion. In some quarters, it's very messy at the moment, I think it's probably fair to say. And you will get a number of people, either because they're thoroughly unfamiliar with Christianity, or because they're indifferent to it, or some because they're hostile to it, and you can expand that to faith generally, who would favour some kind of hard secularism in which Christian values, voices, views are excluded from public life. You'll get many other liberals who are much more genuinely tolerant. So there is this. It's a question of eternal vigilance, really. I think we pay a lot of lip service to human dignity, human rights, human equality, and I think most of the time we mean it. But it's very easy to mean it with your lips and not practice it with your heart, both politically and as a culture. It's very easy to hate. And that's why the advice, the commands in the gospel are so important and counterintuitive. Rule of law, we absolutely take for granted. Well, it's not the case at all. I'm not for a second suggesting that we're about to slide into a kind of anarchistic or totalitarian state by any means, but governments are always gently trying to kind of press the limits of rule of law, because it's a bit of a pain, really.
Right.
So there's always these elements where you don't need to be apocalyptic about them, but you do need to be vigilant.
Well, if you just joined us here on Premier Christian Radio, I'm speaking to Nick Spencer, the research director at Theos, a Christian think tank. And Nick is also the author of a new book, The Mighty and the Almighty, How Political Leaders Do God. It's this fascinating look at the faith of various political leaders. Now, Nick, we can't talk about faith and politics and political leaders without mentioning a particular leader who has risen to prominence on the other side of the pond, as they put it. That is, of course, Donald Trump. What on earth are we to make of the faith of Donald Trump?
Well, I did write the chapter on Donald Trump. I had actually written a chapter on Hillary Clinton in Misguided Faith.
You really thought she'd win?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did wake up on the election morning in a state of considerable shock. Donald Trump is not noted for his piety, and it is interesting, and perhaps one of the most depressing things about the spectacle last year was less Donald Trump and more the way that many Christians who had, during the primaries, distanced themselves from him, preferring other Republican candidates, slowly gravitating to him and managing to swallow or disguise their distaste. There were some, against that, some very powerful, deeply kind of theologically and biblically sophisticated riposts, but that was not an encouraging spectacle. Trump himself he went to church, and I think you get a slight window on his soul, as it were, knowing that he went to a church which was run at the time by a pastor called Norman Vincent Peale. Norman Vincent Peale is probably best known today, if at all, as the author of a book called The Power of Positive Thinking, which was a New York Times bestseller for 3 years or something like that, which was a kind of spiritual self-help, as it were. And I think that either influenced Trump or at least resonated with who he was and what he believed. And I suspect that there is something in that. So Donald Trump's Christianity, such as it was kind of rediscovered on the campaign trail to some extent, is, I have to say, pretty shallow. It's quite self-helpish. And also it seems quite nationalistic in the sense that there is an almost salvific tone to the way he talks about the nation. Now, that comes with the territory from American presidents in many ways, a city on a hill and all that. But I think Trump's rhetoric is, just a notch up from that of previous presidents. So that's how I would summarise it. Pretty paper thin, quite self-helpish, and quite extremely patriotic to the point of nationalistic.
Yes. It does remind me slightly, again going back to Tim Farron, he said very recently that in America it's very kind of normal for politicians to have a faith and it's kind of encouraged. But Tim Farron said that in the UK you almost have to pretend not to have a faith. Was that a fair comment, a comparison between our two countries?
Yeah, it's not too far off the mark. I would have to say that neither situation is particularly healthy. So the need to genuflect before the altar, so to speak, in the US is problematic because you've got to fake it, and because other politicians who may not have Christian beliefs find their their political careers potentially shortcut. Although Bernie Sanders was an interesting example there, who was bucking that trend. In the UK, I think there are quite a few Christian believing politicians, but the problem is that I think there is, let's be charitable, a loss of Christian vocabulary, familiarity, which means that if they talk about their faiths, about prayer, famously, Blair being asked about prayer by Paxman, or about divine judgment, that was another one of Blair's, or about sin, in Tim Farron's case, they're such alien ideas that they're seen to be somehow subverting the normal course of politics as opposed to enriching them or broadening them or whatever else. So it gets to the stage that you don't talk about it, not because you're formally banned from talking about it, this isn't a hard secular state, but because you will be greeted with incredulity or incomprehension in such a way as becomes a vote loser. And that's problematic as well, because it makes for a more dishonest and also, I think, a slightly narrower and less rich political debate.
When Steve Clifford from the Evangelical Alliance sat in that chair across from me a few weeks ago, he said something similar about Christians having to relearn the language of the kind of culture that we live in. And he was really suggesting that a number of us as Christians, we don't quite know how to speak to an increasingly secular society. You mentioned some of the words like sin. Is there need for almost a vocabulary change from Christians? Do we need to kind of meet people in the middle and change the way we speak about things? Or should we just be fighting for recovery and the understanding of these terms and what they mean?
It's a really good question. I think there's a third option there. So, taking those first two options, continue speaking in Christianese, if you like, to a secular culture is going to be problematic for all the obvious reasons. But no less problematic is the idea that you change your language. Now, of course you do that, and Christians have done that all through the years. But changing language also has implications of changing thought and changing worldview, so you've got to be very careful before you do it. You do use the language of accommodation, theologians talk about it, but you do it carefully. The third option is continuing to being willing to speak in an authentic Christian vocabulary, but legitimising that speech through action. So we're 10 years old at Theos. I recently published a report called Doing Good, A Future for Christianity in the 21st Century, which looks at how Christianity is going to develop and progress in the 21st century. And one of the key arguments there was that one of the significant trends and changes we're seeing is a growth in what the report calls Christian social liturgy. It's a kind of Christian social action, but slightly different. Now, the argument is that in actual fact, the lingua franca, the common language for the 21st century, is less going to be language and more going to be action. Because we are living in an increasingly plural society, and it's not Christians, just Christians who aren't being heard, because our public discourse is somewhat fractured. So the challenge for Christians is actually to continue, obviously with a Christian worldview, and even with Christian language, but to show that this is what language of sin, or judgment, or prayer, or pastoral support, or whatever it else looks like in practice. So as it were, you help people understand Christian language and Christian vocabulary by viewing it through the lens of Christian love in practice.
Well, that's a great place to leave it. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but Nick Spencer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I do hope you enjoyed both those interviews with Professor Robert Beckford, speaking earlier to Justin Brierley, and just now my interview with Nick Spencer from the Theos think tank. Final reminder that you can, of course, request a free sample copy of Premier Christianity magazine. It's the magazine that I write for and help edit, and it sponsors this programme. If you'd like to do that, just go ahead to our website. It's premierchristianity.com. Add a /free sample to that web link and you'll be able to get a copy of the latest issue. Also, if you're listening to this on Premier Christian Radio, this programme is now available as a podcast. You can access past shows that way and also keep up to date if you subscribe with all the exciting interviews we've got coming up in the weeks to come. But now, here on Premier Christian Radio, it's time to say goodbye, and I'll leave you with Dave Rose, who's coming up next with Premier Playback.